I'm sure most of you will recognize this as a bucking horse saddle. Standard equipment, third weekend in May in Miles City at the annual Bucking Horse Sale. On this episode of That's Montana, we're going to meet a young man who wrote the history of the Bucking Horse Sale and is a third-generation rural Montanan. John, I'm a Montana native, you're a Montana native, but this is the first time we've actually met face-to-face. Tell the folks who John Moore is.
Well, I'm a third-generation Montana rancher. My family, my grandfather came to Montana from Kentucky and homesteaded out here on the north side between Yellowstone and the Missouri, and what we call the north side, big dry country, big open country. And my father was Johnny Moore, and so I've always been called John or John L. because he was Johnny. And he was a pretty well-known horseman. I think he went to school to about the 4th grade and then went to work on a pretty big horse outfit, the Nichols Ranch up here, which was real big at that time, as a horse wrangler. And he then progressed into riding for the CBCs, and I'm told that he was one of 2 men who rode for the entire duration of the CBCs, which was the Chapel Brothers Cannery. So that was kind of my legacy, was being a son of a CBC cowboy, which my friend Wally Badgett, interestingly, is also. And I was raised here on the ranch. I went to work for the Miles City paper when I was 17 and did a little over 3 years under Paul Husted and Gordy Spear and some really good journalists. Got drafted by poverty into the military and ended up being stationed at Great Falls, where I worked for the Great Falls Tribune. And then when my father passed away, I got a hardship discharge and came home to help my mother because it was that rough winter of 78 and 79. And so I came home, and I've been back here on the home ranch since 79. And I do some freelance work. I've written 8 books, including 5 novels. And I'm not really a historian. Some people refer to me, as an historian. I'm really not. I'm a reporter, novelist, reader, primarily a reader. And I do specialize in horses and horse history, more so than, I read the open range days and the cattle drives, and I read all of that, and I love it. But I probably specialize more in the history of horses in eastern Montana, because while Miles City claims to be the cow capital of the world, which I don't know you could ever officially say it was, all right? It was probably one of 2 or 3 at one time, certainly, and it's still a major force today. But at one time, especially from 1912 to 1919, we were definitely the horse capital of the world, and certainly the horse capital of America from about 1890 to about 1942. And that really defines this Miles City area more than anything, is the horse, and the range horse in particular. Much of this country wasn't fenced until mid-40s. So you had loose horses running in this country up until late 50s, early 60s. There were still, a few that just couldn't be gathered. So this is kind of wild horse country. That's what it is.
Great. Folks, stay with us. That's Montana. We'll be right back. We're going to talk to John about a big event that's coming up in Miles City.
You're not much of a historian. You have lived and grown up around here. Tell us the story of the Bucking Horse Sale in Miles City that has become internationally famous.
Well, the first sale, there's been controversy about this, and people say I'm the expert, so I'm going to be the expert. I'm going to tell you how it actually was, because I did the research. I spent a lot of hours down in the Miles City Star morgue going through old copies of the papers. And the first Miles City Bucking Horse Sale was an unofficial sale, started in 1950, and it was because Les Bow of the Miles City Livestock Center bought a bunch of yearling steers down here at Ekalaka and from a guy named Heavy Lester. And Lester threw in 35 head of bucking horses in the deal. And Les Bow was thinking, well, what am I going to do with this? And so the idea of having a sale kind of came about. So they advertised to people, because my father was supplying horses, for example, to Gene Autry in the rodeo business, and bought a lot of horses out of here. And his main partner was Everett Colburn out of Texas. And Colburn was usually the guy that came up here, you know, and actually bought the horses. So there were these rodeo companies. Bob Barnes, good friend of my dad's. The Barnes Rodeo Company came to Miles City the first time in 1948. And so there were people coming up here to buy horses from Johnny Moore, Bud Kramer, Lockheed Brothers, people like this. And so Les Beau said, bring your horses to town. Well, golly, nobody knows how many came in. The sale lasted something like 3 full days. And at that first sale, nobody knows. 900 to 1,800 head of horses went through. The next year, they got the idea of, well, maybe we'll do it as an annual event. So some people say the bucking horse sale started in 1951 because that was when it was first an official event.
No.
But the actual first sale was 1950. The Jaycees, as a service organization, got involved around 1956 because the livestock center people needed somebody to sell the beer and all the concessions. And there's been all kinds of controversy and all kinds of problems and good things and bad things with the sale, because you don't have something of this magnitude that's just easily handled. I mean, this isn't just a little local rodeo. I mean, this is a pretty big event. But from 50, there were a couple of different things that really made a difference. There was still all the horse flesh out there. Even all these ranches rode horses, and they rode big horses. You have the Texas horses, again, always around 1,000 pounds. The northern horse, because of the need to go through snow and everything, 1,200 pounds. And you had all of these good remount horses that had been crossed on draft horses. I mean, you had all kinds of big rank horses. You had horses running around that hadn't been gathered, for years. And, you still had horses to sweep off the plains. You had bad saddle broncs. I mean, it wasn't, when I grew up, and I don't want to, I was no great hand, and I'm still not. All right, I'm a good storyteller. Now we have this whole new school of horsemanship. All right, all of this is changing and has changed, but it's going to change the future of the sale. Mm-hmm. All that's a whole new dynamic. But what changed the sale and made it so big? The press. Mm-hmm. All right, because it was one of its kind, and so first you had a publication that called Business Week came in, London Times came in, New York Times came in, LA Times came in. The press started coming because it was such a unique event. One other thing that gets left out, Cy Talon, the greatest rodeo announcer that ever stood behind a microphone, adopted the sale as a special of his. And Cy Talon announced the sale for 25 years. Cy Talon brought in class. He was just a classy guy, and he was the cream of the crop of what he did. And since then, there's new dynamics that are involved with the sale. The numbers of horses way down. I really feel for Rob Fraser and Bart Medjid of the Miles City Livestock Commission, because they're responsible for finding horses. Well, there's 10 million horses in the United States, but all the fire's been bred out of them, and all the size has been bred out of them. So today we have breeding programs. We have the Calgary Stampede. We have the Birches down here at Gillette, and they're breeding. All the best horses now are in breeding programs. But up until 12, 15 years ago, they weren't. The breeding program for bucking horses is relatively new. And so if there's any tourists watching this, let's set a couple of things straight. You cannot teach a horse to buck, all right? Flank strap does not make a horse buck. Flank strap makes a horse kick back. But the buck comes out of the heart. If it's not in their heart to buck, you're not going to make a horse buck. You can't train a horse to buck, all right? They either buck or they don't. Now, the bucking horse sale got so famous because of the wild horse wrecks. If you want to watch a wreck, all right, you can come to my place and watch me. But, you can watch hundreds of them there. Change isn't bad. Some of it's sad, all right? Some of it's sad, but change is change, and you have to go with that. But it will impact things like the bucking horse sale, which used to be 3 days of bucking horses, all right? Now it's a night of bulls, 1 day of bucking horses as far as the consigned sale, and then the match bronc ride, that's out of necessity. See, that's not out of pleasing the public, because the public is there primarily to see the wrecks. I don't buy into, the beer drinking, whole aspect of, to me, too much of a sale is a party and takes away from the heritage. I've been involved behind the scenes with a few things. A lot of that was years ago. One of the suggestions I made when I published a little book on the bucking horse sale in 1982 was we've got to make it a sale. People started referring to it as the bucking horse. No, it's the bucking horse sale. What makes it unique is it is a sale. Well, guess what? Spectators don't make a sale, all right? Buyers and consigners make a sale. If your consigners are happy and your buyers are happy, you have a sale. The spectator thing comes afterward. That's one thing that's kind of bugged me through the years as more and more people start saying, well, you're going to the bucking horse, and I'm a purist. And I want to say, it's the bucking horse sale, all right? When we remove the sale from it, we've lost the bucking horse sale. I've put horses through the sale, and so I speak as a consigner too, that you want a good cowboy getting on that horse. You want somebody that knows where and how to put that bronc rein and measure his bronc rein and mark him out and spur him just right and show him properly. And I think that's probably getting a little more difficult. There'll always be, guys getting on, but that's reflective of where we are now in the rural culture with cowboying per se. We have better horsemen today than when I was a kid and then when my father was a kid. We don't have better cowboys, all right? And there's been a revolution in horsemanship, which is a little bit false because there was always the horse whispering attitude in horse breaking with certain people. But the problem that we have today in the West is we have guys that have never rode outside of a round pen, all right? They're used to taking a colt into a round pen and doing, all this amazing stuff. And then you open the gate and head for the hills, the horse is lost, the cowboy is lost. The problem with a lot of horses, too, today, is they're all used for, 99% is for recreation, not for work. But worse than that, so many of them are doing nothing. We have a whole new term, and that's called a pasture ornament. And that's what so many of these horses are. They're standing around in these subdivisions and on the edge of town. People have 5, 6, 7 head of horses that never do a thing, all right? And, I'm schooled out of the old school, my dad, and then more recently Lynn Taylor, and guys that made their living in the saddle. And they know, and I know, that a horse is happiest working. And all these people with horses standing around doing nothing don't have happy horses, all right? They're buying into the image of something rather than the substance of something. And that doesn't make a happy horse. Horses like to work. They like to be in partnership with you. There's very few horses that are just truly versatile. If you want to follow the genesis of a horse in Montana, and eastern Montana in particular, the demarcation line is the winter of 1886 and the death of all those cattle throughout the West. See, that winter, that blizzard in January carried all the way down to Texas. See, it killed thousands of cattle even in Texas. And what it did was it forced people like Granville Stewart to recognize that if you're going to have cattle in Montana, you're going to have to feed them during the winter. All right, you're going to have to put up hay. Well, some guys thought, I'd rather raise horses because they'll paw through the snow, which a cow won't. So they went to horses. Now, imagine this country in the 1890s, for example, where a ranch might have 2,000 to 15,000 head of horses that they were raising. Now, you had people raising Cleveland Bays, you had them raising a French coach, you had them raising draft horses. I mean, it were all these different breeds because they used horses for so many different reasons. Now, a lot of these horses were shipped out of here to the cotton fields in the south. All right, a lot of draft horses were raised up here. And then you had some just regular range horses that were part Indian pony, part Texas cow pony, all this mixture. A little bit of thoroughbred mixed in. Now, in 1912, the United States government took Fort Kill and turned it into a remount station. So the U.S. Range and Livestock Experiment Station is what it's called now, but it's the old Fort Kill, named after Miles Keel, who died at Little Bighorn. And 1912, it became a remount station, and from 1912 to 1919, more horses and mules went through Miles City, Montana, into the United States Army than any place in America. All right, just thousands of them. And it wasn't just the ones they were raising, but they were contracting with ranchers. And then when the remount program went to more of a franchise as opposed to a localized type of setting, they would come out and visit ranches and inspect their mare herds. And if the mare herd qualified, they would bring you a top thoroughbred stallion.
Oh.
And one of them brought to the West was actually Sir Barton, who won the Triple Crown. And there were many great stakes horses that were brought out here, and the Dunnings down here at Ashland, the Iron family over here at Colwood, and many others. Those were probably the two most prominent, raising just some fantastic horses. And that's what changed the quality of the horse in eastern Montana more than any single thing, was the remount program. So from 1890 to about up to 1950, this was still incredible horse country, all kinds of breeds, and not many fences. And there were actually laws passed in states in the 20s and 30s to get rid of all the feral horses that were overgrazing the land. All right. There's 10 million horses in the United States right now, all right, which is more than we need by a long shot. But back then, nobody had any idea. Well, in the late 20s, a man from Rockford, Illinois was on a train going through eastern Montana. His name was Chappell. And he looked out and he saw all these loose horses, and he asked somebody, who owns these? And the person said, nobody. Well, he owned Kennel Ration, dog food, and a big cannery in Rockford, Illinois. And the Chappell brothers then came out in the 20s and began gathering these horses, but also breeding them, which the remount people did too. So the Chappell brothers came in and began harvesting, I guess you'd have to say, harvesting these horses for dog food and human consumption. Because whether, the United States of America, with our moral superiority, does not like to realize that lots of people eat horse meat. And the Chappell brothers had contracts all over the world to supply horse meat. And then the lesser cuts and some of this other, they formed the first canned dog food. Kennel Ration was the first dog food that went into a can. So they had at one time a horse operation in eastern Montana. Nobody knows how many horses they ran.
Can't say thank you enough for what you've shared today. What kind of a legacy is John Moore thinking about as you move on?
Well, legacy is a neat word. So it's a favorite word of mine. I've always wanted to kind of incorporate it into a stallion, if I was going to have another good papered horse, I'm involved in several different things in my life, the ranching, the riding, the ministering. So to a certain extent, there's an individual legacy in each, and then there's kind of a collective legacy. So as not to sound too spiritual and God forbid religious, because I'm not that, but I think if I can be a voice of the land and a voice of the horse in particular, and I don't want to sound pretentious there, because I'm not saying I'm the only one. I'm not saying I've got a corner on this, but I know, again, getting back to that lack of pretension, being real, being the real deal, all right? Lynn Taylor, before he passed away, approached one of the greatest bronc riders that ever lived in Montana, who was not very well known, Larry Kane. And Larry was a itty-bitty fellow. Nobody rode tough horses like Larry Kane. Anyway, Lynn was talking to Larry Kane, and he approached Larry. I didn't know this. He approached Larry about me doing an article on him. And I might break up just saying this because it was such an honor. But Lynn says, well, John's okay to talk to because he's the real deal. See? And so many ranchers and others have been burned by journalists. And I have, and I've been one for over 40 years. But I've been burned by People magazine and, some of these, Billings Gazette even once, And I like most of my friends there and everything. But I've been burned by journalists who had an agenda and who were phonies and didn't know diddly squat about rural life or country life or any of that, and just pretending they did. And I guess if I could leave a legacy, It's to be a voice for the ranchers, the cowboys, the horses that are the real deal.
Well, that puts a wrap on this episode of That's Montana. We hope you enjoyed meeting John L. Moore, a third-generation Montanan from Miles City. We want to thank him for his history of the bucking horse sale and for kind of being one of those real-deal guys. Don't forget, you can visit us on our website at www.thatsmontana.com or visit us on Facebook, too. We'll see you next Sunday on That's Montana.